Most people on the internet treat discipline like a personality trait, as if you either have it or you don't. And if you don't, there's always someone ready to yell at you for it. Wake up earlier. Try harder. Want it more. Look at this person who runs at 4 a.m. every single day. Why can't you? But what if the problem was never your willpower? What if you don't need more pressure? You need a different wiring. Because here's something most people don't realize. You can actually train your brain to crave discipline. Not in a harsh, punishing way. Not in a push yourself until you break way. But in a way where doing the hard thing starts to feel steady, comforting, empowering. Have you ever noticed how on Monday you feel like a new woman? Organized, motivated, focused. And by Wednesday, you're exhausted, questioning everything, negotiating with yourself over even the smallest task. Why does that happen? Why does clarity disappear so quickly? Stay with me, because today we're going to talk about what discipline really is, not the loud version people shout about online, but the quiet version that lives in your patterns, your habits, your daily choices, and how to make consistency feel less like a struggle and more like part of who you're becoming. And if you're tired of surface-level motivation and want deeper, psychology-based tools that actually last, make sure you subscribe now. This channel is about emotional growth that stays with you. And before we go deeper, I want you to think about one thing. What is the one habit you wish you could stay consistent with? Is it working out? Eating better? Not checking your phone constantly? Finally finishing something you started? Keep that habit in mind. We're coming back to it. Let's talk about something most women experience, but rarely say out loud. There's a rhythm to your week. Monday feels strong. You make plans. You promise yourself you'll start again. You feel capable. Tuesday is still okay. But by Wednesday something shifts. You're tired in a deeper way. Not just physically, emotionally. Your patience is thinner. Your focus is weaker. And suddenly the habits that felt simple 2 days ago feel heavy. You sit down just for a minute. You check your phone. You scroll longer than you meant to. And then the voice comes. Why can't I stay consistent? Why do I always fall off? Why can't I just be disciplined? Have you ever said those words to yourself? Here's something important. That cycle, the rise and the drop, is not a character flaw. It's a nervous system pattern. Your brain is constantly calculating energy, safety, and reward. By midweek, decision fatigue is real. Emotional labor is real. Mental load is real. You are not just managing tasks. You are managing relationships, expectations, invisible responsibilities. And when your system feels overloaded, it looks for relief. Relief often comes in the form of distraction. Comfort food, scrolling, avoiding the thing that feels demanding. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is trying to protect you. Let me ask you something gently. Have you been interpreting self-protection as failure? Because that changes everything. Most advice online ignores this completely. It tells you to push harder, override your feelings, crush your excuses. But here's the truth. If discipline requires you to fight yourself every single day, you will eventually lose. Not because you lack strength, but because internal war is exhausting. And that brings us to something we need to clear up before we go any further. You've been taught that discipline means ignoring how you feel. But your brain doesn't work that way. And once you understand what's actually happening neurologically, inside your limbic system, inside your stress response, inside your reward circuitry, you'll stop taking your inconsistency personally. And that's where things begin to shift. Here's the lie most of us were taught. Discipline means ignoring your feelings and doing it anyway. It sounds strong. It sounds admirable. It even sounds mature. But it's incomplete, because your feelings are not random noise. They are biological signals. Your limbic system, the emotional center of your brain, is constantly scanning for safety, energy balance, and reward. It does not speak logic. It speaks sensation, fatigue, tension, craving, resistance. And when you try to override those signals every single day using pure force, something happens. Your stress response increases, cortisol rises, decision fatigue builds, and eventually, your system pushes back. That I don't care anymore feeling, that sudden drop in motivation, that's not laziness, that's burnout. Let me ask you something important. Have you been trying to build discipline using stress as fuel? Because stress can create action in the short term, but it cannot create sustainable consistency. Here's what most people don't understand. Without motivation, there is no action. And motivation is not excitement. It's not hype. It's not loud energy. Motivation is simply your brain assigning value to an action. That assignment happens through dopamine, not the pleasure chemical, but the drive chemical. Dopamine is what helps you initiate effort. If your brain does not perceive enough meaningful value in an action, it will conserve energy. That's not weakness. That's evolutionary efficiency. So when you say, I don't feel motivated, what you're actually experiencing is a neurochemical calculation. Is this worth the energy right now? And if your system is already overloaded, emotionally, mentally, hormonally, the answer becomes no. This is why pure willpower fails. Willpower is a limited cognitive resource governed by the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain. But the prefrontal cortex tires. It fatigues, especially when you're juggling work, relationships, responsibilities, aging parents, children, finances, and your own internal expectations. Now here's the shift. Discipline is not about silencing your limbic system. It's about teaching your brain that effort leads to reward in a stable way. It's about designing your reward system. And that changes the entire conversation. Because once you understand this, you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And you start asking, how is my brain currently wired? That question leads to power. And in the next part, I'm going to show you why trying to feel inspired before acting keeps you trapped, and what actually creates sustainable consistency. Because the order matters more than you think. There's a silent belief most of us carry. I'll start when I feel ready. I'll start when I feel energized. When I feel confident. When I feel clear. But what if that order is backwards? Most people believe the sequence is motivation, action, results. But in reality, especially neurologically, it often works like this. Action, evidence, motivation. That changes everything. Have you ever forced yourself to go for a walk when you didn't want to, and 10 minutes later felt better? Have you ever started cleaning, just one drawer, and suddenly found momentum? Have you ever sat down to work feeling resistant? But once you began, it wasn't nearly as hard as your brain predicted? That's not magic. That's neurochemistry adjusting in real time. When you take a small action, your brain updates its internal model. Your prefrontal cortex sends a signal. We are doing this. Your limbic system recalibrates. Dopamine begins to rise, not because you're excited, but because progress is being detected. Progress triggers reward, and reward builds motivation. But here's where most people sabotage themselves. They wait for emotional alignment. They think discipline means feeling strong first. But discipline actually means choosing alignment with your values before your mood catches up. And here's a direct question. Are you trying to think your way into discipline instead of moving your way into it? Because thinking without movement reinforces doubt. Movement builds identity. When you act, even in small ways, your brain begins forming new neural pathways. Neuroplasticity is not dramatic. It's repetitive. Every time you follow through on a small promise, you strengthen the pathway that says, I am someone who shows up, and identity is far more stable than motivation. Now here's the important nuance. This does not mean pushing yourself aggressively. It means lowering the activation energy required to begin. Instead of finish the workout, it becomes put on the shoes. Instead of write the whole report, it becomes open the document. Instead of clean the entire kitchen, it becomes clear one surface. The brain loves completion, even tiny completion. Completion releases dopamine, and that dopamine reinforces the behavior. So the goal is not massive intensity. The goal is consistent initiation. Let me ask you something gently. When you avoid something, is it because it's impossible? Or because your brain has exaggerated the cost? The anticipation is often heavier than the action. And once you understand that, you stop negotiating with the whole mountain. You focus on the first step, because the first step is where wiring changes. And now we're ready to talk about the method, the 4 shifts that turn discipline from something you fight into something your brain begins to expect. This is where it becomes sustainable. Now we move from understanding to training. Because insight alone doesn't change behavior. Practice does. There are 4 shifts that quietly transform discipline from something you fight into something your brain starts expecting. And once your brain expects it, resistance drops. Let's walk through them slowly. Shift 1. Separate what you feel from what you do. Now we move from understanding to training. Because insight alone doesn't change behavior. Practice does. The first shift is the most subtle and the most powerful. Most of us live fused. Our emotions and our actions feel like the same thing. I feel tired becomes, I can't do this. I feel overwhelmed becomes, I should stop. I feel anxious becomes, something is wrong. But that fusion is an illusion. Your limbic system produces sensations. Your nervous system reacts to stress. Your brain generates interpretations. But none of that automatically determines your next action. Here's what's happening underneath. When you feel resistance, your limbic system sends a signal. That signal is fast, emotional, protective. Then your brain tells a story about it. And most of the time, you believe the story. Not because it's accurate, but because it feels convincing. Let me ask you something honestly. When you feel discomfort, do you assume it means stop? Because discomfort and danger are not the same thing. Fatigue is not failure. Resistance is not incapacity. Lack of excitement is not lack of ability. So here's the practical shift. Instead of saying, I can't, try. I notice I feel tired. I notice I feel resistance. I notice my brain suggesting I avoid this. That word, notice, creates space. And space is power. When you name a feeling instead of becoming it, your prefrontal cortex re-engages. That part of your brain is responsible for long-term decisions, identity alignment, and values. And every time you pause before reacting, you strengthen that neural pathway. That's neuroplasticity in action. You're teaching your brain. Feeling something does not mean I must obey it. And here's something important for women, especially. You have been socially conditioned to treat emotional signals as instructions. If you feel guilty, you fix something. If you feel anxious, you withdraw. If you feel tired, you collapse. But emotional maturity is not suppression. It's separation. It's the ability to say, I feel this, and I'm still choosing my next step. Let me give you a small example. You feel tired at 7 p.m. Your brain says, skip it. Tomorrow. Instead of arguing with yourself, try this. Yes, I feel tired, and I'm going to do 5 minutes. Not because you're punishing yourself, because you're practicing separation. You're teaching your nervous system that discomfort is survivable. And once your brain learns that discomfort is survivable, resistance loses intensity. Here's a powerful question to carry. Is this discomfort a warning? Or just weather? Because weather passes, and if you treat every cloud as a storm, you'll never build stability. Separation is the first layer of discipline. Not force, not hype, awareness. Shift 2, begin before you believe. This is where discipline stops being theory and becomes wiring. Most people think the sequence is feel motivated, take action, build consistency. But neurologically, that's backwards. More often, the sequence is take action, create evidence, build motivation. And that shift alone changes everything. Let me ask you something directly. How many times have you waited to feel ready? Ready to start the workout? Ready to have the difficult conversation? Ready to organize your space? Ready to focus? And how often did that readiness actually arrive on its own? Motivation is not a mood that descends on you like inspiration. It's a neurochemical response to movement. When you begin, even in a small way, your brain updates its internal prediction. It says, we're doing this. And once movement is detected, something subtle happens. Dopamine begins to rise, not because the task is thrilling, but because progress is happening. Your brain is wired to reward forward motion. It doesn't reward intention. It rewards initiation. And this is why small beginnings are so powerful. When you start something, even for 2 minutes, you reduce avoidance. Avoidance keeps cortisol elevated. Movement reduces it. Think about the last time you avoided something important. The longer you avoided it, the heavier it felt. The moment you began, even slightly, did the tension shift? That's psychobiology. Stagnation increases stress. Movement creates regulation. Your nervous system prefers action over rumination. So instead of asking, do I feel like it? Ask, what is the smallest aligned action I can take right now? 2 minutes. Open the document. Put on the shoes. Send the message. Wash 1 dish. Write 1 sentence. That small start matters more than intensity. Because small starts are repeatable, and repeatability is what builds neural pathways. Here's the deeper layer. Each time you begin without waiting for motivation, your brain registers something important. I act even when I don't feel like it. That creates identity evidence. Identity evidence builds stability. Stability reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety makes action easier next time. This is how discipline becomes self-reinforcing. Let me ask you something honest. Are you waiting to believe you're disciplined before you act disciplined? Because belief often comes after behavior. You don't become confident and then act confident. You act confident enough times and confidence forms. You don't become disciplined and then act. You act consistently enough times and discipline forms. This is neuroplasticity. Small action, small reward, repeated, strengthened pathway. And over time, your brain starts associating effort with relief instead of threat. That's when something surprising happens. The thing you used to resist starts to feel stabilizing. Not exciting, not dramatic, stable. And stability is deeply rewarding. This is the shift where discipline starts to feel empowering instead of punishing. Because now you're not forcing yourself. You're initiating yourself. And that's a very different energy. Shift 3. Expand gradually, not dramatically. This is where so many strong, intelligent women quietly undermine themselves. You decide it's time to change. And you don't do it halfway. You go all in. New routine. New food rules. New productivity system. New boundaries. New standards. You clean everything. You wake up earlier. You cut sugar. You set strict goals. And for a few days, it feels powerful. You feel in control. Focused. Determined. And then, something shifts. You wake up tired. Your body feels heavy. Your brain starts negotiating. And suddenly the routine that felt empowering feels overwhelming. What happened? It wasn't weakness. It was overload. Sudden, dramatic change activates your stress response. Your nervous system interprets massive change as a potential threat. Cortisol rises. And while cortisol can temporarily increase alertness, sustained elevation disrupts dopamine stability. When dopamine becomes unstable, effort feels harder. And when effort feels harder, avoidance returns. So you interpret that as, I lost discipline. But the truth is, you try to sprint a marathon. Let me ask you something honestly. Are you trying to prove something to yourself? Or are you trying to build something sustainable? Because those are two very different motivations. Proving is intense. Building is patient. Building requires repetition. Your brain changes through repetition and manageable challenge. That's neuroplasticity, not dramatic transformation. Gradual reinforcement. Think of it like strength training. You don't lift the heaviest weight on day one. You increase load slowly, because muscle grows under tolerable stress, not overwhelming stress. Your nervous system works the same way. 10 minutes becomes 15. 3 workouts become 4. 1 focus session becomes 2. Not because you forced it, but because your capacity expanded. And when capacity expands, effort feels less threatening. Let me ask you something deeper. When things get hard, do you interpret that as failure? Or as adaptation? Because adaptation feels uncomfortable. But discomfort during growth is not the same as dysfunction. There's a powerful shift here. Instead of saying, this is too hard, you begin saying, this is my edge. Your edge is where neural rewiring happens. When you stay just slightly beyond comfort, not dramatically beyond, your brain learns that effort is survivable. When effort is survivable, resistance decreases. When resistance decreases, consistency increases. And consistency is what changes identity. You don't need to overhaul your life. You need to expand it slowly. Because what you can repeat, you can keep. And what you can keep becomes who you are. This is how discipline becomes smoother. Not effortless, but smoother. And smoother is sustainable. Shift 4. Change your environment before you change yourself. This is the shift most people ignore. Because it feels too simple. We're taught that discipline is about inner strength. But behavior is shaped by context more than by character. Your environment is constantly influencing you, whether you notice it or not. Your phone within reach. Open tabs on your laptop. Snacks visible on the counter. A cluttered desk. A loud room. Notifications lighting up. Each of these is a cue. And cues trigger behavioral loops. This isn't weakness. It's conditioning. Your brain is constantly scanning for reward signals. If your phone is next to you, your brain anticipates dopamine. If stress is high, your brain anticipates comfort. If distractions are easy, your brain chooses the lower effort reward. That's not a personality flaw. That's stimulus response learning. Let me ask you something gently. Are you trying to out-discipline an environment that is designed to distract you? Because that's exhausting. Instead of asking, why don't I have more willpower? Ask, what is shaping my behavior right now? Try this experiment for one day. Carry a small note. Every time you drift off task, write down what pulled you. Was it boredom? Was it fatigue? Was it a notification? Was it emotional discomfort? You'll start to see patterns. And once you see patterns, you can intervene. Move the phone to another room. Prepare healthy food ahead of time. Clear one surface on your desk. Block one distracting app. Set one boundary. Small changes in terrain create large changes in outcome. Because when friction is reduced, action requires less negotiation. And negotiation is what drains cognitive energy. Here's something powerful most people don't realize. Every time you intentionally adjust your environment, you strengthen your internal locus of control. You teach your brain, I can shape my circumstances. And when you believe you can shape your circumstances, your nervous system relaxes. Because control reduces perceived threat, and reduced threat stabilizes dopamine and cortisol balance. This is how discipline becomes lighter. Not because you forced yourself harder, but because you stopped swimming against the current. Think about your water, your daily rhythm, your routines, your social influences, your self-talk, your digital habits. If your water is chaotic, discipline feels like survival. If your water is supportive, discipline feels natural. And here's the deeper truth. When you change your environment, you change what feels automatic. When what's automatic aligns with your goals, discipline requires less emotional effort. And when discipline requires less emotional effort, consistency becomes easier to repeat. Over time, something beautiful happens. You begin to trust yourself, not because you're perfect, but because your actions match your intentions more often. And trust is deeper than motivation. Trust is stability. So now pause. Think about the habit you named at the beginning. Which of these 4 shifts does it need most? Do you need separation from emotion? A smaller starting point? Gradual expansion instead of intensity? Or a change in your environment? Once you identify that, discipline stops feeling mysterious. It becomes trainable. And in the next part, we'll talk about what happens when you repeat these shifts long enough. Because repetition doesn't just create habits. It creates identity. And identity is what makes discipline automatic. At first, discipline feels mechanical. You pause. You begin. You adjust. You repeat. It feels intentional. Sometimes effortful. But something subtle starts happening underneath. Your brain begins updating its internal story. Not in words. In patterns. Each time you follow through on a small promise, your nervous system registers something important. I can influence outcomes. That belief is called internal locus of control, and it changes everything. When you believe that your actions matter, motivation stabilizes. When you believe that your effort creates results, dopamine becomes less dependent on external validation. When you believe you can steer, even slightly, anxiety decreases. Because uncertainty feels smaller when agency feels larger. Let me ask you something honestly. Do you feel like life mostly happens to you? Or like you shape it? Because that belief quietly drives your behavior. If you feel powerless, your brain conserves energy. If you feel capable, your brain invests energy. That's neurochemistry responding to perception. Now I want to give you a metaphor you'll carry with you. Imagine 2 fish swimming in the ocean. An older fish passes them and says, "How's the water?" They keep swimming. A few seconds later, one fish turns to the other and says, "Wait, what's water?" That's us. We live inside environments, habits, emotional climates, routines, and rarely notice them. Your water is your daily context, your morning rhythm, your digital boundaries, your relationships, your stress patterns, the way you speak to yourself when you're tired. If your water is chaotic, discipline feels exhausting. If your water supports you, discipline feels natural. And here's the shift that makes discipline addictive. When you repeatedly show up, even in small ways, you stop seeing discipline as something you do. You start seeing it as who you are. Identity changes neural expectation. Your brain begins predicting follow-through. And when the brain predicts follow-through, resistance decreases. Because now the action is aligned with identity. Not with mood. Not with pressure. Identity is stable. Mood is not. Let me ask you one final question. When you imagine the woman you want to become 5 years from now, what does she do on a random Wednesday night? Does she collapse into guilt? Or does she do a small thing that keeps her aligned? Discipline doesn't mean perfection. It means continuity. It means shrinking the task instead of shrinking yourself. It means beginning without drama. It means protecting your terrain. And here's the truth. No one says clearly enough. Real freedom is not doing whatever you feel like in the moment. That's impulse. Real freedom is choosing your long-term values over temporary discomfort. That's power. And power feels calm. So when Wednesday comes, and it will, you don't ask, "Why am I like this?" You ask, "What is the smallest aligned action I can take right now?" And then you take it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just steadily. Because the more often you repeat that choice, the more your brain associates effort with self-respect. And self-respect is deeply rewarding. That's when discipline stops feeling like punishment. It starts feeling like dignity. Before we close, I want you to return to the habit you thought about at the beginning. Picture yourself doing the smallest version of it tonight. Not the perfect version. The consistent version. Now imagine repeating that 3 times this week. That's how neural pathways form. That's how identity shifts. That's how you become the kind of woman who doesn't need hype to move. If this resonated with you, make sure you subscribe. There's so much more we can build here together. And if you want to go deeper into your emotional development, I created a practical guide to emotional self-mastery to support you. It was designed to help you regulate your emotions and build inner stability step by step at your own pace. You'll find the guide in the pinned comment below. Because discipline isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more aligned with who you already know you can be. And once your brain learns that effort leads to stability instead of shame, consistency stops feeling like a battle. It becomes your baseline. And that is when discipline no longer feels forced. It feels earned. Thank you for being here.